to the award-winning Rick Amato Show, presented by the Washington Times. The Rick Amato Show. Irreverent, informative, interactive. Online at AmatoTalk.com and on air at 1170 KCBQ.
Good evening, everyone. This is TJ O'Hara, the Common Sense Czar, and I'm filling in for Rick Amato tonight. We have an absolutely exceptional show for you with in-studio guests as well as two great individuals calling in. I'm joined by my first guest, Richard Dreyfuss. Richard is the founder and president of the Dreyfuss Initiative, a nonprofit organization committed to revitalizing America's civic culture. He serves on the American Bar Association's Education Committee, the board of the National Constitution Center, the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was senior research advisory member of St. Antony's College and Oxford University. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Hiya.
It is a pleasure to have you here. I think, most people are familiar with a more visible part of your career, but I think very few people recognize the fact you've actually been an activist American citizen for decades at this point in time.
Yeah. I was raised by two people who believed that if you weren't active as a citizen, you weren't a citizen. And every once in a while, something will happen, and I can hear my grandmother getting ready to kick me in the head if I don't do something about it. And that's a very living presence in me. And I don't think there is such a thing as being a good American unless you are actively working to better your country.
I agree with you. Now, you've done a myriad of things. You've been a spokesperson on media informing policy, on legislation, on public opinion. What drew you into that initially?
The belief that no one really believed that the people had any right or talent to know the subject at hand, that they could just be told what to say or think or do, and they would do it. And the fact is, civics is not an elective. Civics is a fundamental necessity. It's a basic requirement, and no matter how you define it, and I define it as simply as I can, it's learning how to run the country before it's your turn to run the country. And if you don't, then someone else is going to run the country, who is not mandated by the Constitution to run the country, which means it will be run by thieves. And I am out to stop that from happening.
You fit right in with the common sense czar. I know you have used the phrase in the past, common senselessness. You want to share with the audience what your interpretation of common senselessness is? Sure.
Common senselessness is the illogical atmosphere that we live in. If I used my former art as my example, in every paper in the country, there's a list every Sunday. The 10 best films or the 10 most popular films of the year. It's always based on a gross receipt, a gross figure, which means it's a meaningless list.
Yeah.
Because there's no inflation ever taken into consideration. If they factored in inflation, then you'd know that Gone with the Wind was, is, and always will be probably the most popular film ever made. No journalist has ever said, we're not going to publish this, we want to publish a meaningful list. That's common senselessness.
Tickets sold.
Tickets sold. The agreement...
Based on population, as a percent of the available population, that'd be a good way to do it.
Yeah. All you have to do is ask yourself, what makes sense here? What makes sense? There are examples in every sector of the paper. I could take the Union Tribune every day, and I could find in style, in fashion, in sports, in foreign affairs, in the front page, in techno, no matter what, I could walk back a story to the decay due to the lack of the teaching of values untaught, of civics untaught, because we don't know who we are unless we're taught, because we are the only country in the history of the world that is connected only by ideas. And if you're not taught those ideas, you're not bound. And you only pretend to patriotism. If you're taught what those ideas are, the ideas of the protection of civil liberties, that the government has no right to oppress you, even if it's your own government, that you have rights regardless. If you're taught those rights, then you have them. If you're not taught them, it's like the tree that falls in the forest that nobody hears. And that's why we've raised up generations of kids who feel unempowered and spoiled at the same time. We have raised up kids who believe that they deserve everything that the world could possibly give them, but they wouldn't work for them, because why would they have to work for them? They're Americans. They're better. It's a senselessness that has pervaded all of our look at television and news of murder trials. We've done something in the last 20 years that was never allowed before. We've analyzed the guilt and innocence of people who haven't been brought to trial. That has been a non-starter for 1,000 years, and yet we do it every day. And so we've ruined the lives of how many innocent people? No one stands up and says, wait a minute, we shouldn't do that. That's wrong, and it's against the law. We break the law. Our institutions that we've come to rely on break the law. Our elected officials who we've come to rely on and elect into office break the law, and they do so without any fear of being held accountable. And that, to me, is the only way, as Lincoln once said, the only ones who can beat us is us. The only way we're going to get beaten is by ignoring the strengths and values of Republican democracy. And when you have elected officials break the law, go to war, refuse scrutiny by the Congress, and have no fear that they will ever be indicted or held accountable, that's the end of America.
Right. Yeah, I actually mentioned in the national platform of Common Sense the freedom of the press, and I specifically cite as an example in that what you just brought up, the fact that we have taken unjust liberty with that, and the press has given away the responsibility that comes with that freedom. And I use the example of the trials where we pre-try people. And it's really great for selling advertising, and it's great for stimulating interest and stimulating audience. But the reality is a lot of times it turns out that's not the way the case turns under our judicial system. So what is the fairness? And I'm not talking about if someone is acquitted because there wasn't sufficient evidence, but the implication is perhaps they were guilty, but they got away. Under our justice system, we would rather not convict 1,000 felons rather than convict one innocent person. But it's the innocent people whose reputations are destroyed. So I
did a
absolutely
show.
Understand what you're saying.
I did a show in New York called Exonerated. It was the trial testimony of people who had been declared guilty of capital crimes and were totally innocent. And in some cases, it took 22 years to establish their innocence. And at the end of every show, I would ask the audience, if you thought that sending someone to the chair was a correct method of helping society, and then you found out that someone you'd sent to the chair was innocent, what would you do to make up for your sin? Would you apologize? Would you financially help their families? And I remember Tom Clancy, the writer, saying, well, he must have been guilty of something. And that was his way out.
Well, let's talk about the Dreyfuss Initiative. What was the catalyst that brought that about? Tell us what the Dreyfuss Initiative is about, and why is it important?
The governor of Maryland, a month and a half ago, reached into his curriculum, moved aside all the other subjects, and took hold of civics and the money that was used to teach it and took them out and removed them. Why? The only way our kids have to learn how to run the country was removed from their sight and sound. Why? Either we teach our kids what we wish them to know, and we don't teach them what we don't wish them to know, or we do things out of such stupidity and thoughtlessness that we don't understand the consequences. The fact is that the governor of Maryland, in either whether you define it the first way or the second way, did something so self-destructive, so destructive to the future of the country, that he guaranteed failure. He and his generation gets an F in being able to pass on the American dream, and he is condemning every child in Maryland to fail, to be outthought and outmaneuvered by the world, which is not pro-American. The world is just the world, and life is just life, and if we're so dumb and silly that we don't know how to sew, cook, understand due process, hammer a nail, or build a chair, we're going to get what we deserve, and our kids will not thank us. Our kids will come to us and say, "How could you have done that to us? How could you have abandoned us because you couldn't afford to teach us? I thought you said we were the richest country in the history of the world, and yet we couldn't afford to be taught what we needed to know." We make no sense when we look into the eyes of our own children 10 years from now. We don't make any sense, and we will have to answer to them.
So, with respect to the Dreyfuss Initiative, how does that help address the issue?
It draws attention to the idea that something is not an elective, that something is not unimportant, but something is urgently, critically necessary. If you don't know how to run the country, you're in trouble. If you're on an airplane and you hear an announcement that says, "We're going to pick our pilot from business class today," you'd get off that plane. And if you went to a doctor who had not gone to medical school, you wouldn't let that guy touch you. And yet we treat citizenship, sovereignty, being the final arbiter of political power, with a dismissive and contemptuous hand. We say, it'll happen all by itself. It doesn't. This is not a machine that goes by itself. This is a machine that takes work, that takes attention, that takes everything the preamble to the Constitution says it does. Anyone who wants to know what it takes to run this country should read the preamble aloud, because they're all verbs, they're all activities, and they're all things that every generation must learn and do well. Learn and do with excellence, or else life will fall on us like a ton of bricks.
You know, when you talk about preambles, if we think about the one from the Declaration, I think one of the things that resonated with me that I know that you believe in, we believe in a lot of the same rights that are very important: privacy, freedom of speech. But you talk a lot about individual accountability and how that needs to be taught. And when I do speaking engagements, a lot of times I use the Declaration, the preamble to the Declaration, get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say the guarantee of happiness.
Right.
It doesn't say Richard and I will write a check to make sure that you're happy. It's the pursuit of happiness. What we need to do is provide an equal opportunity.
And what we're providing is the very first time a curse that mankind has lived under has ever been fought. We have lived under a curse that says, you are a serf and your grandchildren will be serfs because my heel will always be on your neck. No matter where no matter what country, we will prevail over you because you're nothing. Until America said, wait 1 minute. If you can make the journey, if you can actually get here, if you can take what life throws at you, if you've got discipline and rigor and a sense of ambition, you might rise by merit in your own lifetime. And that was the most important message in the history of civilization. And it was heard in every corner of the world, and that's why people come here. That's why they'll always come here. And the fact is, our kids don't know what the hell I'm talking about because they're not taught about it anymore. They're not taught that we are a political miracle and that we are safe haven and that we are a second chance because nobody ever offered that before us.
Richard, what do you think created in the educational system the replacement of civics with perhaps more politically correct courses? What began that evolution, and why did we tolerate it?
Actually, I think the odd answer to that is civil service and bureaucracy. When people talk about big government and small government, what they're really talking about are bureaucracies that never die. And in the old days, the Democrats used to meet the ships at the dock and say, "Hello, my name is Jack O'Halloran, and I'm your district boss, and if you give me your vote, I'll give you a place to live and a job." And they'd fire the guys that were working under the Republicans, and they would give them that house and that job. And then civil service came in and said, "Nope, you can't fire anyone from now on." And the Democrats had no reason to meet anyone at the dock. And that's why this thing happened where we just hit the ceiling and stayed where we were. Hit the ceiling and stayed. There were ways that the culture has always had to give us an exit out and an exit up, and that was taken from us just around the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century. And ever since then, we have been bumping into furniture, not knowing what to do and where to go.
And I think as a society, we've embraced a political addiction, if you will, that is polarized. So we choose not to have a civil discourse. And I know within the context of the Dreyfuss Initiative, there's a heavy concentration on teaching people to have civil discussions. And I think that's of such paramount importance to get back into the curriculum.
You know, people should remember that we never had civil discourse. What we had was uncivil discourse, but lots of time to get over it and lots of time to rethink things. And what happened was that our technology forced us closer and closer and closer so that it removed time from decision-making. And people only had yelling and screaming and uncivil behavior. Thomas Jefferson was as uncivil to John Adams as we are today, but there was time to let it smooth out. And now, with television and streaming and personal computing, we have no time to think, we have no time to take a breath. So all we have is yelling and screaming, and we've raised up public discourse to a new low.
You know, when you bring up Jefferson and Adams, while they had very strenuous arguments, they actually grew back together as friends. And, you know, coincidentally died on the same day, on the 4th of July.
I would wonder whether how sincere their friendship was. I would say that it would be a wonderful exercise to go back and redefine our founding fathers, that first generation, because there's no such thing as a generation of great men who are above party and above party differences. We just let them write their own biographies, and so they all wrote themselves as great angels.
No question about that. Now, if people want to get more information about the Dreyfuss Initiative, where can they go?
Here's what I've done. I've created three things: a curriculum of how to teach teacher and student, a way for what you learn in civics classes, the values you learn, to get into the culture, and one thing more, even bigger. The curriculum is a curriculum of reason, logic, clarity of thought, and critical analysis, using civility, debate, dissent, context, and opposing views as exercises. You can use those in every classroom. I've created an American history play competition so that in every regional theater of the country, at the end of every season, you do a play about American history and you could win a financial prize of something in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's a good reason for writing a play.
Very good reason.
And third is, in all of the years since we've begun this country, there's never been an institute or research think tank to support Enlightenment values. And we now have a relationship with the George Washington family, and we have created out of their retreat in Charleston, West Virginia, an ongoing institute for the study of Enlightenment values, which are the values we learn in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And that will outlive us all.
That's outstanding. Well, Richard, stick with us, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Dr. Lynn Goldfarb, Assistant Professor of Clinical Education at USC, and Scott Faulkner, world-renowned author, consultant, and former key member of the Reagan White House, and now Executive Director of the Dreyfuss Initiative. This is T.J. O'Hara, the Common Sense Czar, filling in for Rick Amato this evening with my guest in the studio, Richard Dreyfuss. And we are joined now by phone by Dr. Lynn Goldfarb, a San Diego resident who's also an assistant professor of clinical education, secondary social studies curriculum coordinator at the University of Southern California. Welcome to the show, Lynn.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure having you here today. You know, Richard and I have been talking about the Dreyfuss Initiative and tangentially about the civics crisis in this country. You've been doing this for over 24 years, been involved in the public school, secondary social studies, environment district office coordinator for educational reform. You're at the front edge of this. How critical is this crisis at this point in time, and how important is the Dreyfuss Initiative?
The Dreyfuss Initiative is coming at a time in our public school system where we're seeing many, many challenges. We're seeing high percentages of dropout rates out of high school in different sections of the country. And we need to look at, once again, how to renew our responsibilities to this country, to democracy, to understanding what that involves as citizens and citizenship. And in the schools right now, we have so many curriculum standards that we are obligated to fulfill that we have almost in some respects let this piece drop out of our focus. And the Dreyfuss Initiative is bringing that back into focus.
So it's filling a vital gap that we have in our public school system at this point.
Yes, it is. And the curriculum that was created by the Dreyfuss Initiative is actually very complementary to what we do in schools. It's very easily integrated into what we can do in our schools, and it's very necessary and very, very, very important. And at this point, unfortunately and sadly, our students, our teenagers, don't understand what their role is in this country. And they do not only not understand it, they don't understand how they can affect change, what that responsibility could look like, and they don't really understand the workings of government anymore. And the youth, unfortunately, have become very disenfranchised, and they are indeed our future.
And how does that contribute to some of the dysfunctional political environment that we see today?
It's unfortunate when we look out there, for example, and we see the discourse that's going on, let's say, for example, with respect to our budget. Our students, this is a very rich context from which you can have many, many conversations and create very, very interesting discourse within our classrooms about understanding how did this come about, why is it that we're so polarized with respect to what one side wants, what the other side wants, and why is it that we're not able to come to some kind of conclusion that could be a win-win for the citizens in many respects in this country. And our students really don't understand why that is or how that's come about. And Richard mentioned this just a few minutes ago with respect to discourse. We don't do discourse anymore in classrooms. We don't necessarily critically challenge our students to think, to debate, to look at both sides of an issue, or to look at more than both sides of an issue and understand how to look at things not only critically, but creatively as well in order to come up with solutions.
And very quickly, because I know you're on a very tight time schedule, and I really appreciate your giving us a bit of your time this evening, but how has some of the change in the books impacted this? I know there's almost been a casual rewrite of history in some cases. What have you seen in the social studies environment that you've been exposed to?
It's very compartmentalized. I actually had the opportunity to work on a social studies text a number of years ago, and it's like sound bites of information. So it really doesn't get a student to look in depth at history, to understand all the different aspects of, for example, what went into the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's very factual, it's very superficial, and then let's move on. And Richard had mentioned something about having the time to think. We're not giving our students the time to think and to delve deeply into subjects, and instead this was a revolution, now let's move on because we have to take a test.
Absolutely. I understand what you're saying. Anything else you'd like to add before I let you get back to the engagement that you were involved in?
I find this a very exciting time. I am very excited about what the Dreyfuss Initiative wants to accomplish, and it's extremely timely because every generation, and this isn't unique to what I'm about to say, President Lincoln said it on the eve of the Civil War, every generation has to renew its commitment to its democracy. And I really feel that the Dreyfuss Initiative and all the aspects about what it is bringing forward is once again reminding us that we have a lot of work to do in order to renew that commitment to the Constitution, to our Bill of Rights, and to democracy in this country.
Well, Dr. Goldfarb, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know it was asking a lot to have you step out of the engagement that you were involved in, but I certainly appreciate your time. Love to have you back on the show when we have a little more of your time. But thanks again for joining us, and we'll look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And now we are going to be joined by Scott Faulkner, who is the Executive Director for the Dreyfuss Initiative. And I want to give you a little bit of his background. If I gave you all of his background, I would need like 3 more shows. Scott is the author of the critically acclaimed bestseller, Naked Emperors, The Failure of the Republican Revolution. He's had articles published in the New York Times, the Washington Times, various other business publications. He has appeared on every radio show known to mankind, every network, corporate advisor on strategic change and leadership. He works with governments and corporations in emerging economies, bachelor's degree in government, master's degree in public administration. He studied at the London School of Economics and Georgetown University, national personnel director for the 1980 Reagan-Bush campaign, and then became part of the presidential transition team and served as a member of President Reagan's White House staff. Went on, within the context of that administration, to serve in executive positions for the FAA, the GSA, and the Peace Corps. And more recently, he served as the first chief administrative officer of the United States House of Representatives. Now, to put that in perspective, that's the non-legislative operations of the House. It's about $1 billion budget, 14,000 employees, and his business-based reform saved over $148 million under his guidelines. And his model of business-based reforms are now being used by 44 national parliaments around the world. His approach was named one of the top 100 innovations in American government by the Ford Foundation and Harvard University. Americans for Tax Reform named Scott an outstanding member of Congress. He has 26 management awards and 4 presidential letters of commendation. And Scott, when I welcome you to the show, I've just got to ask you one simple question.
Sure.
What did Richard see in your background that gave him any thought that you could help him?
I think the main issue is that, of course, Richard and I had known each other through some of our historic preservation efforts. But I think the key is that we both recognize that revitalizing America's civic culture is really foundational. As Richard likes to say, it is pre-partisan. And so to have Richard, who is a centrist, and myself, who is a conservative, who's moved center as well, and having the two of us in 100% agreement on what needs to be done shows that this is not some Trojan horse for either side of the political spectrum.
I think that's a very important point because just as I try and do through my trilogy, if we don't start getting the sides talking and we don't start moving in a common direction, we're going to see this senseless partisanship continue that does nothing more than aggravate all of us.
Exactly.
Now, the Dreyfuss Initiative is really the first national civics movement of its kind. Can you kind of bring our audience up to speed what distinguishes TDI?
The main issue is that TDI is a fully integrated, multifaceted approach to our civic culture. As you look at, there's literally hundreds of groups that are working on civics, and yet our civic culture continues to unravel. And the main reason is that most of them focused on one class or one simulation or one book or even one demographic and think that magical silver bullet is going to reverse literally decades of deterioration. What we've come up with, really Richard as our leader has come up with, is a fully integrated approach. If we're looking at an unraveling civic culture, the reweaving of that civic culture is going to have to draw on many different threads and bring them back together. The K through 12 curriculum pipeline to get our young people prepared to be true, engaged citizens. The arts, engaging not only the writers and the playwrights and the plays companies themselves, but also looking at other media to bring civics and citizenship back to center stage. And then finally, looking at our entire intellectual moorings, the foundation of our foundation. The Founding Fathers did not wake up one moment in 1776 or 1787 and magically come up with representative democracy and 3 branches of government and an independent judiciary. They read and interacted with the thought leaders of the time. They read the books of John Locke and others in a century before, and that is the Enlightenment. And so bringing the Enlightenment back to center stage, giving people an opportunity to understand the foundation of the foundation is really what this is all about.
Scott, let's talk about each of those 3 legs to the stool, if you will. Let's start with the American History Play Competition that Richard spoke to briefly towards the end of our first segment. Tell me a little bit more about that, and Richard, feel free to jump in any time.
Well, Richard, of course, this was especially his main area because he's pretty much appeared on almost every stage among the League of Regional Theaters, what we call the LORT theaters, and these would be like the La Jolla Theater in California, the Guthrie in Minneapolis, the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. And the key is figure out how do we prime the pump, how do we inspire the arts to focus on American history, both the actual facts, events that shaped our history, but also looking at alternate history. What if something didn't happen, or what if something did happen, and how does that help us inform ourselves on what kind of country we are and what kind of country we need to avoid becoming?
Ultimately, I think there's something that should be said, which is that this ends in an emotional place, in love of country. And one of the things that will make me lose my sense of humor very quickly is to be told that because you're not right-wing, you have no right to love your country, or you have no right to love your flag, or you have no right to support the troops if you don't support the policy. These are the things that make me lose my sense of humor. I am fascinated and in love with my country. I think it has given gifts to mankind unknown and unlike any other country ever did or ever will. I think we have much to be proud of here. And to be told that you can only express that love if you're on the right is, to me, a waste of love and devotion. And there are so many great stories in America that you would want to see them as plays. You'd want to learn from them. How many oaths did Robert E. Lee break in order to love his country and what was his country? How many great stories are there? When Texas was thinking about secession a few years ago, I said, I can bring Texas back into the Union without even talking to Texas. And they said, why? How? I said, just tell them the story of Sam Houston, who was the most eccentric, enormous personality that ever lived in this country. There are extraordinary things to devote yourself to, and all we have to do is know them.
You know, you have brought up in some other writings something that I thought was interesting, that other countries' writers and performers humanize historic figures and formative events, and recent American movies and plays tend to demonize ours, and I think that was a great point. Now, we've talked a little bit, Scott, about the George Washington Institute. Share with us a little more about the Curriculum Enhancement Project.
Again, taking Richard's core curriculum and taking it across the entire spectrum. We call it civics across the curriculum, and that means that a person teaching mathematics, a person teaching biology, a person teaching music or the arts can bring examples and themes of citizenship into those classes beyond just the typical English classes and social studies classes. And so we've formed a national curriculum team made up of some of the leading scholars and practitioners in curriculum development and early childhood development. And we have been building what we call curriculum maps, which are suggested learning activities, key questions, and support materials to take into the classroom. We've begun working with a number of leading universities and have actually begun piloting teacher certification seminars, which we've been doing over the summer because this is the time teachers get to take time. These are K through 12 teachers get to take time to earn credits and recertify in different areas. So we've got one certification seminar that's specific to civics across the curriculum. We have another one focusing explicitly on the life and learnings of George Washington,
who, by the way, personified better than anyone else the values that we hold dear and hold as cherished. He established the template of what a great president was. He was not a particularly eloquent man, but what he said had weight and dignity and depth. And if we all followed his example, we would never be hypnotized away by demagogues. He was the last to be a demagogue. He was a realist and the first American, the first man loyal to the whole nation.
And when you look at George Washington, and you have many people from the Enlightenment onward who've written wonderful words, but it's the deeds of George Washington that really resonate through time. He's the only person who has walked away from power twice. He was the head of the victorious army. He could have become a dictator, another Napoleon. He didn't. He was a wildly popular president who had been unopposed. He chose to step down after 2 terms. When he was president and presiding over the Constitutional Convention, he acted as an honest broker instead of injecting himself. And the other part is Washington was a person who learned. I mean, he was a bit impetuous during the French and Indian War. Some people say he actually started the French and Indian War.
Yeah, he was a bit impetuous. Yeah.
And so the key is that he learned and seasoned with time and became then a mentor in his later life. And that's exactly the story of America. We may have been impetuous in our founding, but we learn and we grow and we become a mentor for others.
Hey, I've always said if they were going to make a movie about him, they could do a play on words of one that's already been made and just call him the man who wouldn't be king.
Exactly.
And Scott, real quickly, before we go to break, where can people go to get more information, and how can they help with the Dreyfuss Initiative?
The Dreyfuss Initiative is www.thedreyfussinitiative.org. Our current website is under renovation. I mean, you can go onto it, but we're going to have a much more elaborate website and more interactive by Labor Day. But on the website, there is material dealing with our curriculum. We also have a YouTube channel where Richard's remarks from many different forums are featured, and people can write us. And again, or email us off the website. We're very interested in ideas. We're very interested in partners. And, of course, we're very interested in getting additional resources because a lot of our effort is volunteer. But as we move to these more detailed programs, we're always looking for financial resources to underwrite these programs and ultimately to endow some of the scholastic efforts.
I would say also 2 things. If you believe in this country, or you believe that it can be the country that you thought it could be when you were in the 5th grade, then help us get there and send us money. We need money because we're not a branch of the government. We're just citizens trying to get this accomplished. And the second thing is this. If you disagree, if you think for some reason that it's not important to teach the young the basic fundamentals of civics, of how to run the country, call in this show or write us at thedreyfussinitiative.org. I dare you, because I've spoken to 170,000 people and no one has ever disagreed with the necessity of teaching the young.
Well, it has been a great show. I really appreciate your time. And I'm going to ask everybody to, open your minds, open your hearts, and open your wallets. Go to the DreyfusInitiative.org. See if you can participate either as a volunteer or monetarily. I know it's a wonderful organization doing wonderful things. And most of all, I'd like to thank you for listening. This is the Common Sense Czar, and I approve of this message. Good night, America.
The Rick Amato Show on KCBQ.